Hello and welcome to Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. In each episode of the show, we hear the insightful confessions of a successful leader who wants to inspire others to live their professional and personal dreams. I am always keen to hear your feedback, particularly in relation to the kinds of leaders you would like me to invite onto the show in future. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the rich insights from our special guest. Hello and welcome to another episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. I'm delighted that Graeme Horsfall has joined me in the studio today. Graeme, welcome.
Hi, Andrew. Good to see you on the end of this call.
Yeah, really looking forward to hearing your journey today. But for anyone that watches the show, we always like to get to know our guests first. So just tell the audience a little bit about who you are and where your current focus is.
Sure. I'm Graeme. That's spelled A-E, not H-A-N, which is something even my grandmother still suffers with that kind of spelling challenge. But so yeah, look, I'm mid-40s. Can I still say that at 46? It's almost late 40s. It's heading that way, right? So late 40s. Clearly, I am Scottish. Right? I can't really hide that. So I'm sure you will tell me to slow down if I become just like unintelligible. But yeah. So late 40s, father of 3 kids, 3 teenagers, in fact now, which is terrifying. I don't know how that happened, or I blinked and suddenly they were 16 and 15. 2 dogs, live on the west coast of Scotland, not too far from Glasgow, but in the countryside in the west coast of Scotland, where I occasionally get the odd day of sunshine. Most of the time it's wet and dark, but other than that, it's not a bad place to live, really. I've had a pretty good career over 25 years or so. Graduated as an engineer and ended up in sales in technology. That was my journey, really. I've worked right through the technology industry, right through fintech, all the way back to the dark side of IT. So I worked for the 2 big giants for quite a long time. So I started my career with IBM as an engineer, and then as a technical sales specialist, and then as a salesman, a fully blown IBM salesman. And then I moved into Microsoft and enjoyed about 9.5, 10 years there. All of that in just one part of the business, which we may or may not touch on later on, but all commercially facing roles. And then that's really where my leadership career and people management career really started. Then I had my first early practice midlife crisis, which was 9 or so years ago now, where I decided to leave the corporate world and go into startup land. And I joined the first of 3 small startups in early investment stage and scale up stage. And enjoyed some real success with that. That journey took me into fintech ultimately, where I was later able to spend time with some of the fastest growing businesses in the world then. So Revolut, I spent a little bit of time in. I spent some time with iZettle as well, which was later bought by PayPal. And then most recently, I ran Global Payments, which is like the largest payments company you've never heard of, probably. Global Payments, I think, is the 4th or 5th largest payment processor in the world. And I ran their UK and Ireland business for the best part of 3 years, really. And I'm just coming back into the workplace, actually, having enjoyed an amazing 5 months off to indulge my hobbies. Right? So you're catching me having spent the past 5 months largely on my bike somewhere in the Scottish countryside, right? So that's me. That's a quick whistle-stop tour of my career and my life and where I am today.
Yeah, I look forward to exploring each of those elements a bit more deeply. And cycling obviously is a passion for you, but what else is it that you do to when you are working, when you have to switch off and maintain that balance in terms of re-energizing? What else do you do apart from the cycling?
Sure. Well, look, I try and spend as much time with the family as possible. So I have 2 boys and a girl, so clearly different interests. But I enjoy cinema. That's a massive passion in our house. My youngest son is trying to get me into these card game things like Magic the Gathering and stuff like that. So he's coaching me through that. He's a hard coach, by the way. So I have to have developed a thick skin to get me through that. But those things are big passions of ours, and holidays and travelling are as well. We're lucky enough to have a camper van, and we've had some great adventures in that. And then I guess our guilty pleasure as parents is we're a massive Disney household. So we've spent a lot of time in Florida and visited some of the other Disney parks as well. So that's a big part of our travelling life as well. So they're the things I do outside of the craziness of email and tech jobs.
And very typical, but my favourite movie is the Shawshank Redemption. I think it comes.
Well, yeah.
What's yours? If you just name the sort of, I know we all have different moods for different. But what's the standout
Yeah.
movie for you that you always go back to?
So the standout movie for me is, I mean, it's a big Hollywood film, but it's not that well known. It's called The Game, and it has, I think it's Michael Douglas that's in it, and I can't remember the other actors, but it's just a brilliant film with quite an unusual set of twists and turns in it, and it's a bit of a surprise all the way through. So I really love that film. It really holds my attention all the way through. Right, it's not one I very often fall asleep during, which happens quite a lot.
I'm going to look that one. Brilliant. Thank you for that. So let's take you back.
No worries.
This is all about, what shaped us as leaders, and obviously we mature, but that sort of early experiences we have in our sort of first systems of family and education, and moving into those first roles really determine our leadership style. So, what about you? Tell us about those early years and how it shaped you.
Sure. Well, I guess I was thinking about this a little bit earlier, how I might answer this question, but I guess it's only when you get older that you get the opportunity to really reflect back quite far and think, well, some of these things were laid quite early, and then some of them were then quite heavily influenced, in my case, by one or two kind of health events, I guess, that happened to me quite early in my career and then a little bit later in my career, or more recently in my career. So when I think about this, I think about I have always been pretty ambitious and pretty driven. Most of the time, pretty unrealistically so, right? Actually, that unrealistic piece has carried right through my career. That's, not that I would ask anyone to play violins when you say I've got unrealistically high standards. And I have had that, right? And that's been to my detriment, but also to my advantage at times. But I guess it really started when I was about to start primary school, and I came home. I think it was my second day. I came home from school. My parents still recount this story, and I was really upset and actually pretty grumpy and slightly narked off. Really, I think is the phrase my parents used, because I hadn't learnt French in my first 2 days of being at primary school, right? And this was something I was really looking forward to and had massive expectation that within 40 hours I would be fluent in another language. Right? Sadly, on the east coast of Scotland, where I grew up, that wasn't the case. You didn't get taught French until you were in primary six. Right? But the point of that is not that it's just a funny anecdote. That kind of underpins kind of the sort of person I am, right? Which is I love to learn. I'm pretty driven at that stuff, and pretty high standards, right? So B's were a failure for me, not because I was pushed, just I'm wired that way, right? My parents were never pushy, always supportive, but never put me under any pressure or anything like that. I never really had any pressure on my family either. I'm one of the few members of my family to go through university and do all of those things, but always very driven and ambitious. So, I was fortunate in many ways. Straight A's at school, and the first thing I failed really, or I considered a failure, was my driving test. Failed my driving test for the first time and was utterly shattered by that experience, right? And no amount of consoling would help, but I passed it the second time, thankfully. But those sort of anecdotes kind of give you a bit of a sense of, I guess what a strangely driven person I am, probably, and that it's very genetic and very long term. It's always been me. So you naturally carry that through university, and you carry that into your career. And I think that the first big change is when you move from academia into your career, your professional career. And what you're chasing then is something that is only defined by you, largely. There may be some expectations set within the workplace and those sorts of things, but it's largely set by you. And it's also to deliver things to you that you didn't probably really think much about when you were in academics. It's about the house, it's about financial security, it's about social status to some extent. It's about all of those things, right? Or certainly at that early stage of your career, it definitely is. It's also about acquiring stuff, right? That's the other element of it, right? So that first piece was how do I get on the property ladder and get my first mortgage and buy my first house and all that sort of stuff. And I guess I was kind of initially met when I graduated. I made a very deliberate choice at that point to move out of engineering and into a commercial role. I started my career with IBM, and I started my career with IBM because I won a sponsorship when I was at university. So I put myself through all sorts of hurdles to win that. I was successful at winning that. That proved pretty lucrative during my 5 years at university, and it gave me a lot of early experience in the workplace, which was really, really good. And at that time, IBM employed 7,000 people, not far from where I live today. So it was a great start in your career, like to work somewhere like that. It was all manufacturing. So it was everything that IBM made that you could buy and put your hands on, apart from mainframe computers, and that you could buy in Europe, Middle East, and Asia, was all made here in Scotland. It was the UK's largest exporter at the time. So fabulous experience. But it was very clear that as I was coming to the end of that period with them as part of my university degree, that it was gradually being picked apart and moved to all four corners of the planet, right? Which is largely what happened. And today, in fact, it's a hole in the ground. What was 7,000 people in a mile-long plant is now just a big empty valley, right? Which is sad, but that's just what globalization does. And I knew then that I didn't want to work in China that early, so I was going to move out of engineering and move into sales. And I did that because at that point I was ambitious to run a big business, right? And in order to do that in a company like IBM, you had to have done sales, otherwise you were never going to get there, right? So that was what drove me down there. So already I was aiming at something quite high, and I wanted to acquire a lot of stuff and so on and so forth. So I arrive down in England, my now wife, long-suffering wife actually, and girlfriend at the time, and we moved down south together. I met her in IBM, but she ended up choosing a different path and went to work for the John Lewis Group, and I obviously stayed with IBM. And I was about to start, so I started the graduate sales program with them to get my tick in the box, which was to pass IBM Sales School, a 6-month training program, before you were allowed anywhere near a customer at that point. And about 3 or 4 months into that, so I was 23, I think, pretty young. The first stumbling block was appendicitis, right? Most people get things like that at some point in their life, unfortunate, but I had appendicitis. But during the process of that, they discovered a lump, and before I knew it, I was getting surgery and all sorts of other things. And at that point, I wasn't really listening to the doctor. I just had a lump. It was an operation. It was stuff and nonsense. It would be done, and I would be back in to finish my graduate program because I'm on a fast track, and that's what matters, right? But that wasn't to be. I went to the hospital after that operation, and they said, well, bad news, it's this. It was a super rare form of cancer at that time. Thankfully caught very, very early, but it was like, I remember being given some horrible statistic, but it's one of those statistics you don't really want to be told by anyone, which is, this is like only the 5th recorded case of this since the 1950s or something like that, which is what eventually the specialist at, I've forgotten the name of the big cancer hospital, the Royal Marsden. There you go. So I was fortunate enough to be treated there, and there was a specialist there that said, we've really, really not seen this before, but we've read about it. So the good news is, because of the way we call it, we should be able to cure it, but bad news is it's pretty arduous, right? So you're going to have this, and you're going to have to do these things. And I know that there's a lot of people you see, some of the worst sides of that treatment when you visit a facility like this. Like, they perform miracles, really, but the health cost of the process of curing something like that, as anyone who's gone through it will tell you, it's quite horrifying, actually. Some of it, it's very bad for you, the treatment process, right? Thankfully, it results in much better outcomes today than it did in the past. But So I went through that, and again, at that point, I largely ignored a lot of it. So you got a very driven person who frankly saw this as an absolute inconvenience and total interruption to a program that he was in to achieve all those things that I've spoken about. And it was my first big foot on the ladder. Thankfully, I had loads of great support from my wife and my parents and things like that as I went through it. But I worked all the way through it. IBM was amazing during that process, hugely supportive. And I got through all the treatment, but I didn't really stop to take a breath as I've reflected on it. I just went to work. I did the treatment, went to work the next day for the morning, went to the hospital in the afternoon, got more treatment and so on. So it just kept going. I got through it all and got the green flag. And 3 weeks after I'd finished my last round of radiotherapy, still with sore skin and all the rest of it, put myself on a plane back to Brussels to finish my sales training. And that sounds like, oh, what a hero, right? I was the complete and utter idiot, right? I should not have done that, right? So, because what I did there was I didn't give myself a chance to breathe. I put a lot of onus and responsibility on the people in the program to keep an eye on me because I clearly wasn't keeping an eye on myself. I prioritized only getting through that sales school process. And put loved ones under a lot of stress whilst I just went and did all that stuff blindly. So I don't think of that as heroic. I think of that as my first massive bit of ignorance of how not to look after yourself, really. So that said, I got through sales school, I graduated top of my class, all the rest of it, all the plaudits and all the things that you get. So again, very ambitious and driven and so on and so forth. And what I didn't realise had started to happen is I thought I was getting back to normal and didn't surface again for another 5 or 6 years was that I was gradually, that ambition and drive that I had, I'd actually pressed fast forward and I'd deprioritized all those things that you asked me about before, like what do you do to unwind? So, Doctor, I only lived for my work largely, and thanks to the patience of my wife, even at the weekend, I would sometimes go into work and sit in the office because you didn't have Wi-Fi at home at that time. Dial-up was no use, and because I was prioritizing a race to the next thing, and then I moved into Microsoft, obviously, still on that aspirational track. And a few years after we had gotten married, we obviously decided to start a family, and cancer had made that significantly more complex for us. Thankfully, I had an oncologist who had the foresight to help us take precautions before then so that we could ensure that we could have a family later on. So we started that process, and of course that process is a massive physical and emotional toll on my wife, huge. So I think at that point I'd started to kind of, as well as being in fast forward, I was also like, oh gosh, this is actually having a really broad effect on other people, right? This thing that I went through and my body did to me. Again, you just swallow that because it becomes a process. You go to the hospital, you get your drugs, you take your drugs, you monitor all your statistics, and eventually it works. It took us about, I think it was a couple of years, and thankfully, because we both worked so hard, we were able to fund that. I know it's not easy for a lot of people to do that, but we were fortunately in a position that we could. But it's a long process that you do, or we certainly found ourselves giving up hope during, right? But then all of a sudden it works and you've got twins on the way, and it was amazing, right? It was great. We sold the house that we had to buy our house and all those things. But at this point, all those things I've just described to you, the fast forward, the broadened impact and effect, started to impact me at work. Because I was about to move into my first proper leadership position at that point, which was really into sales management initially in Microsoft, running a team of 8 or 9 quite senior salespeople. I had just come off the back of working on a couple of very big projects at work, which had successfully delivered. I'd won an award for one of them. So everything on paper looked like it was going well, but actually I was getting increasingly grumpy, sleep wasn't working. Wife obviously was heavily pregnant at the time with twins on the way. We were between houses because we were in England. Of course, the process is so different to Scotland. So we managed to sell our first house, moved into temporary accommodation whilst we picked our other house so that we could be without a chain and all of those things. 27 weeks into that pregnancy, my wife went into premature labour, which is not uncommon apparently with twins, but of course it was just something I ignorantly wasn't expecting. And neither was she either. Thankfully, all went well. The kids were born obviously super early and very small. We were in hospital for 8 or 9 weeks in special care, but have come out of that largely unscathed. So again, extremely fortunate to have lived through that. A week after they came home, I crashed and burned. I just wasn't sleeping anymore. Couldn't really compute at work. The first time I can ever remember being rubbish at work. Just not being able to do anything, struggling to remember things, massive mood swings. I'm really high stress, I guess, is really what it was. I was putting a lot of pressure on myself, and that was amplifying because I pressed fast forward and never dealt with it. Again, fortunate enough to have worked for, yet another pretty amazing company that gave me a lot of support and gave me access to a lot of support. And it was actually my manager at the time signed me off. He said, you need to go and deal with this. You've just brought 2 kids home. That's all that matters right now, right? So take as much time as you need. No one needs to know. When I hit this button here, we'll release a whole load of care around you as well, which is what they did in the end. And one of those things was to go to an occupational therapist, which I had didn't really ever know that they existed, right? But she's a really fascinating woman. In fact, I spotted her years later. She was on a TV show, one of these Channel 4 shows about, God, it's Phil and the women who help you search for another house, that sort of thing. But her and her husband were on it, and she was in her 80s, but behaved like she was, my age now, right? Incredible woman, had an amazing life. And I went to see this really unassuming lady, still one of the wisest people I've met. And after talking to me for a while and reading my history and the report of my manager and my doctor's note and everything, she put it all to one side. And I'm sitting in this tiny little home office spare room in this beautiful part of Berkshire in a village called Sonang, if you know it. Anyway, I was sitting next to the window at the time and I remember it vividly. And she went, Graeme, your problem is that you're trying to do everything too quickly just in case. And I was like, just in case of what? Well, in case you die. That's why you're behaving like this. And I was quite startled because I thought the experience of therapy would be very coaching and soft, and it wasn't. She was very direct and punched me in the eyes, basically, with a statement like that. And it's haunted me ever since, that statement, because she was so fantastically correct. And of course, I never experienced an epiphany after cancer or anything like that. It just was just a miserable experience, and it changed me for the negative actually in the immediate term, really. And it wasn't until that point that I reflected on it and thought, actually, yeah, that is how I feel. I do feel like someone's put me on fast forward. I think it's taken me probably 15 years to balance myself out over that time, right? It's not like someone said that to me and all of a sudden the sun came up and everything was better. It wasn't like that. It was, life kind of ticks on and you have moments where you deal with things better than others, but you always have that thing in your head that says, like, what does she mean by that? How do I deal with that? How do I turn it into a positive? And, eventually I got back to work. I was much healthier as a result and so on and so forth. I was a successful 5 or 6 years in Microsoft after that, but probably about 3 years later, so 2 years before I left that company in the end, I'd been promoted a few times since. It was still hard charging at my career, but I had young kids at the time, and that's an amazing stress relief. Like that definitely, it brings different stresses, obviously, but it definitely reminds you when you come home that you can't do email, right? You've got all your attentions on them, and that was super healthy for me. So I loved that time. But I was still pushing very hard at work, and I was leading people at that point, and it was quite demanding, and all of those things had targets on my back, and took great pleasure in making sure that we met them or exceeded them, and enjoyed the fruits a lot, of what that brought in terms of career development. But my mood swings had started to get worse again. All of those things had started to happen again, and we were just in the process of relocating back to Scotland at that time. I stayed with Microsoft during that relocation. At that point, my wife sat me down and said, look, you need to go and sort yourself out. You're going to have to go and see the doctor. Otherwise, you're going to have a discussion about this not really working particularly well. And that's when I went through another period where I was eventually diagnosed with mild to severe depression and anxiety as a result, or general anxiety disorder, which was brutal, really. I'd always viewed that stuff as, if I ended up like that, that would be a monumental failure. And, since my enlightenment, I've realized that that's how most people feel, right? And it's often surprising how many people you don't realize do suffer from these things. But they were really two very big pivotal moments that really, in answer to your question, shaped me as a leader really quite heavily. And moving too fast and charging at a career harder than is really necessary, and missing out on a lot of other things that ultimately has a ramification in the end. And then getting diagnosed with something I'd always viewed as internally as a bit failure on my part to not deal with something properly. And obviously I was educated to the fact that, probably I was always predisposed to something like that. But then started a period of medication and help to try and balance some of that. And, little did I know that some of my colleagues who I did open up to had recognized some of those things in me before I had, forgetting things, working too many hours, maybe being a bit too direct in my confrontation at times, and those sorts of things. So they were big things for me. I guess the next part of this discussion is, how did they affect me as a leader, and how have I developed since? And I think that especially later in my career, so at this sort of phase, you've had a bit more time to self-reflect, and hopefully you've achieved some of the things that originally used to burn you when you were a young graduate pushing themselves up the corporate ladder. So got the house, done the holidays, life is kind of at a level, family are okay, and you start to afford yourself a bit more time to realise, one, I wish I'd looked after myself a bit better. But it's made me far more open as a manager and a leader to remembering a few key things. One is, it matters if you have team members that you can see are not looking after themselves outside of the confines of the company. And that is especially true, in fact, it's even more important, I think, as I've started to manage bigger and bigger organizations, and, the people I'm managing are, have significant organizations underneath them. So they're leaders in their own right as well. Are they watching for those impacts on their team? And are you, as their leader and their manager, checking in to ensure that they are approaching work in as healthy a way as possible? You can't be responsible for it all, but you can certainly watch out for it. And I think that my experience has given me, maybe at times, too much spidey senses about those things, but it really matters because it impacts you as a manager. If you're managing people that are having challenges like that, it can take its toll on you. It can have a massive ripple effect in the organization, especially if those leaders don't recognize it themselves. And the other really negative effect about not getting the balance right with, I guess, your mental health at work and the balance that works for you. So are you getting enough free time outside of work and those sorts of things? It starts to train others around you, especially if you're in a position of influence, to behave the same way. And that ultimately becomes very destructive. It can make meetings difficult. It can make achieving targets difficult. It increases the level of stress beyond where it needs to be. And then it causes more personal harm to those individuals. I think it's made me far more empathetic as an individual. Because I think I recognise those failings in myself. So you kind of spot them in other people much easier. But I'll be honest that it's taken me until I was 46 to be able to really appreciate the importance of prioritising life before work. And it's so counterintuitive, but you'll actually be far better performing in the latter if you take life more seriously. And some people would look at me and say, well, that's great advice, Graeme, but clearly you, from the outside looking in, you look pretty successful and you've done all these things, and that big IBM plant I told you about right at the beginning that employs 7,000 people. Well, I live in the house that vice president of the last vice president of that plant owned. I bought it off him. And that sounds like such a tiny thing, but it was a really big thing to me, right? So by any measure, you're successful if that's, but I was still that guy that was depressed, really stressed, relatively unhappy, and not taking life seriously. And what it meant was that on 3 separate occasions, the first one I've already described to you, I was signed off work for a month and a half because I couldn't function anymore. And you'd think I'd have learned after the first time, but I didn't. It took me another two, right? But the cost of that isn't, you must have really beaten you up. The cost is actually to yourself and other people around you. It's the stress it caused my family. It's the disruption it caused at home. It's the extra added worry about what's the impact of his health. We need him around. And I think that I think as a leader today, especially in a very noisy world, I think it's a prerequisite now in leadership is you've got to be able to spot those things in other people, not because people are softer or anything like that. I don't think that. I think that actually humans can achieve a lot more than they already have if they get those things right and they remain healthy. Of course, positive stress in some forms is a good thing. It drives us to do things. If you're not looking after your people and you're not able to spot those things and create an environment where they're not frightened to talk about it as much as they feel they're able to, then you're not going to get the best from them. And you're ultimately going to create a place that you spend more time in than you'd really like to imagine. And you spend most of your week in those places with those people. But if you're not actively working as a leader to make them fun and engaging and healthy, it will bite you eventually. Not just personally, but your own business and your team's performance will suffer. So that's a really long, wandering answer, Andrew, but hopefully that tells a bit of the story.
Well, it does. And it raises two questions for me, if I may, Graeme. So I really appreciate you telling that. And the reason I appreciate it is because as well as, what you've been through, which many people listening to this and watching this would have gone through their own version of that in terms of some illness that's just taken them straight down out of the blue. And then they've obviously had to come through that and still working, etc. There's something you're talking about there where if we talk in saboteur language that Shirzad Chamine talks around the saboteurs that help us self-sabotage for being successful. You've talked about two there, hyperachiever and restless saboteur. And the restless saboteur is really interesting because it can also manifest in leaders when they've actually lost a parent at a young age.
Right, okay.
Not them that suffered a near-death experience or become very close to mortality. It's actually losing somebody and therefore they believe, again, for the right reasons, that life's too short. I might not be here like my parent was and therefore I'm going to make sure I achieve as possible, which in itself, as long as it's healthy and balanced and looking after yourself, isn't a bad thing. But if we just are generations, you've been describing this. So people that have also lost a parent will be able to relate to what you've said. So my question to you is, bearing in mind the makeup of you and the people listening to this that resonate with it, we're not very good at asking for help, even though we realize what we're doing is maybe pressing the self-destruct button in terms of the working that we're doing. And you were pointed to the occupational therapist. You didn't seek it. You were told to go. So what advice would you give to leaders out there that resonate with this about how they might be able to go and get some help, even though we know it's very difficult for them to go and ask for it?
So, I mean, the obvious answer is please, please, please go and ask for help and tell people, partly because you'll be very surprised at well, certainly it's been my experience that I've been very surprised by how warm and supportive people are when you tell them, right? I don't think there are many people in the professional world. There are people, but there aren't many people that are not very quick to switch into the fact that they're just a human like you, right? When you tell them those things, right? So, and the hardest bit is just that first step. I know that because I have had to learn, I guess, to ask for help post that initial experience with the occupational therapist. I mean, there was one situation only a couple of years ago where I knew I was teetering on the edge again. My medication was all over the place. I was traveling like crazy. I've had a big trip to take to the US. I was, meeting with a CEO of Fortune 500 and like just all these crazy things, right? And my anxiety was through the roof, and I was in a bit of a state, but But actually, I discovered that it's even easier now to get that help. So I quickly logged into an app. I think it was BetterHelp or something like that, and I had someone on the end of the phone, and within 24 hours, like just gently talking me through a few things, and it's just enough to ground you. So one today, then, and simple answer to your question is there is more help available than ever, and it's accessible in really unobtrusive ways. The other piece is remember. I've said this already. I think that remember that the hardest bit is just that first. It's just getting the first few words out to say I need help. That's the hardest bit. Once they're out, everything gets better. And the third thing is you'll be amazed and surprised generally how warm and supportive people can be when you open up about a vulnerability like that. So that would be my kind of 3 bits of advice, probably. Hopefully that answers the question.
No, it does. And I'm sure this is my last question to you, Graeme, but I think everyone will want me to ask this, bear in mind they've been listening to it. So bear in mind the journey you've been on and what's been driving you and that constant thirst for success during the career, and obviously trying to get ahead of yourself. What does success look like for you now in the future? So if you were to determine success and describe it in your own words, what does it look like for you?
So for me, it looks like work becomes much more fun than it ever has. So I'm doing it because I enjoy the pursuit of the goals, and solving the problems. And that actually goes back to something my dad said to me when I was really young, when he was helping me out in my maths homework, which I still vividly remember, which is when you're getting stressed about it, just treat it like a puzzle, right? And it's taken me till I'm 46, 47 now to see work that way, right? So, and the reward is switching off at the end of the day and knowing that I've got a whole bunch of people that I either love very much that I'm going to go on holiday with and have an absolute blast with because I've learned now how to switch my phone off and leave it at home. Or two, I'm going to go out with a whole bunch of buddies on my bike and, enjoy the countryside that I live in and not feel any pangs of, God, I need to get back to the email. For me, that's what success looks like now. And actually, there is a third bit as well. And anyone who's listening to this who knows me knows that I'm obsessed with the number 3. So I've got to have 3 things for everything. And the third thing is my physical health, and investing in that. And that's more important than anything, I think. So the other 3 things, that's what success looks like for me now. And I'm closer than ever to experiencing that, actually. But it's been a pretty bumpy road, right? But yeah, hopefully again that answers the question, Andrew, and gives you some insight there.
Well, it does. And what I love about that answer, and we'll finish with this, is that what you've just described to me in terms of what success looks like could have been the answer that we could have given both you and I 10 years ago, 15 years. Yet it takes us, it was 47 for me, by the way, so it was 8 years ago when I decided the same thing, and I'm now living the life I want to live as you're going to live. So yeah, I just hope everyone out there really understands the message from your story today. I appreciate your vulnerability, Graeme. I really appreciate you being so open with us, and I just wish you obviously good health going forward, and looking forward to what it is you're going to be doing next when you can tell us all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, Andrew, thanks very much. I start my new career adventure in 2 weeks' time, actually. So I'm super excited about that. But yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me and asking me the questions.
Thanks, Graeme.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader. You can access all previous episodes of the show at confessionsofaSuccessfulLeader.com. If you are interested in finding out more about conscious leadership and self-coaching, just type in Andrew Tallents into LinkedIn or your favorite browser, and you'll find my contact details and all the content that you need. Until next time, don't forget to stay present, curious, and above all, conscious.